As anthropologists study language, and in the same way as anthropologists study living cultures, the topic of globalization becomes very, very important. So, what is it? Well, in a sense, if you think about the prehistoric time period and the historic time period, and then when you think about within the historic time period, the rise of modernism. Again, modernism can be expressed in many different ways. Think about it technologically for a moment, right? The rise of urban landscapes and industrial landscapes. At the end of the modern age, we see a new process at work. And that new process is something that we could identify with or connect with or call globalization. It is a kind of hyper modernity. So, what is globalization? Well, think of it as a process, a social process that transforms the globe. It breaks down national barriers. In a sense, it is transnational in nature. What else does it do? It promotes change. Change in what? Well, change in traditions. As we reduce the amount of space between communities, as we increase community contact and community contact across cultural boundaries, this process of change is inevitable. So, transnational, it is a process of change. And in a sense, it is a process of change that intensifies the interlinking of individuals across the globe. Now, a person might say, well, that interlinking is a good thing, and it is. Communication is always good. However, when we frame the process of globalization in light of something like colonialism and an expanding global marketplace, we realize that something else is connected to this process, which is that these interconnections result in mutual dependency. So the idea here is that globalization is a process. It is a process that emerges at the end of the modern age. It is hyper-modern in the sense that it builds on all of that modernizing process by definition in terms of an expanding Western landscape, an expanding industrial landscape, global urbanization. It builds on all of that. But it breaks down, in this case, ethnic distinctions like nationality. It is transnational in nature. It promotes change, but change on a global level, change for nations, change for people. And then it interlinks communities or hyperlinks communities in such a way as to create intensive mutual dependency. What happens in my community is no longer isolated from what happens in your own community. And language follows this process as well. However, language is, of all the things that we associate with culture, language is something that ultimately will change at a much slower rate. Why? Well, to understand this, we have to go back to the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, the idea that your language, because it is introduced so early on in your social and cultural development, it is something that is almost hardwired into your cognition. And on a group level, it is probably the most important thread or resource that is involved in creating a communally agreed upon cognitive map of tradition, of practices, of geography. This lecture and a lot of what you're looking at in terms of your course are ultimately going to now tie into this process of globalization. And we want to specifically take a look at what's happening to languages. Are they being replaced? Or are they connecting in some way? To examine this process of social change and of an increasingly smaller and smaller world, we're going to look at a film, and it's a film that was produced in the mid 1970s, looking at the Trobriand Islands. The Trobriand island group is part of Melanesia linguistically, and it is famous among anthropologists for the work of a functional ethnographer, or generally uh, the individual that we recognize to be the father of modern ethnography, Bronislaw Malinowski. Now, when Malinowski went to the Trobriand Islands, there was the practice of ethnographic writing and ethnological comparison in anthropological circles. However, the scientific approach that Malinowski took and the amount of intensive detail that he gathered as he reconstructed and recorded the cultural traditions of, in this case, an island nation, was new. When Malinowski visited the Trobriand Islands at the turn of the century and in the opening decades of the 20th century, he was looking at fishing traditions, he was looking at religion, he was looking at a lot of the different important areas that we still to this day study as anthropologists. However, his discovery, the particular quality of Trobriand life that he focused on intensively and is best known for, is economic exchange. In this case, an exchange strategy that connects to the noun and the verb of kula. Well, the Trobriand island group experienced in the 19th and 20th centuries the same kinds of colonial practices that many of the island nations throughout Oceania experienced. The film that we're looking at takes a look at, in this case, the interactions of cultures and what was left behind as part of that globalizing process. The distance that separated Europe, specifically Great Britain, and France, from different island nations in this part of the world in the South Pacific was greatly reduced during the age of colonialism and prior to that exploration. The Trobriand Islands, in a sense, were impacted by this colonial practice. They were also impacted by the Second World War. We know that the Pacific theater was significantly impacted by Second World War. So Malinowski and his Argonauts of the Western Pacific gives us an understanding of Trobriand culture, the cultures that make up this unique archipelago. He records qualities or aspects of the language or languages, because there's more than one language that's spoken throughout the archipelago. But then world history and this process of globalization, which includes colonialism and decolonialism, which I'll be mentioning in just a few moments, these additional kinds of forces or processes which are underneath the umbrella of globalization, all of these things have a significant impact on life in this region. Not only the traditions of people, their religion, their community practices, their mortuary practices, their trade, but also it has a pretty significant impact on their language or their linguistic traditions. And so this film looks at that, and it looks at, in a sense, how the process of globalization, how globalism came to impact, in a sense, Melanesia or the Melanesian landscape. So in this slide, I have a few takeaways that I'd like you to keep in mind, even prior to looking at the film, but then definitely things to reflect on after witnessing the film. Generally, what are we seeing? We're seeing an ethnographic film that is documenting, in this case, how globalism is being expressed in terms of tradition, sport, um, and religion or magic, and language in this part of the world. It, in a sense, will tie into larger cultural themes, social cultural themes, such as cultural invention and syncretism, the idea that people are adapting, inventing new lifeways, new traditions, as they are being exposed to, in this case, more global traditions, traditions from outside of their culture. And then they are syncretizing, they're blending, in a sense, these particular kinds of traditions with their own social values and practices. And the language will express that. Finally, and something that ties us back to the work of Bronislaw Malinowski and his study in the early 1920s, at least published in the early 1920s, is the unique role that magic plays in the lives of individuals. The idea that the division between magic and everyday life is very blurred. In fact, some may say there is no division between these two realities in Trobriand life, and so we will see that. So there will be particular kinds of linguistic expressions, there will be particular kinds of carvings, there will be colors that are associated with important qualities within the cosmology of the Trobriand individuals and the people who are speaking, in this case, Kilavira, or sometimes it's referred to as Kiravina, um, a language common to this part of the world. The language that you will be studying more closely, Bugatu, is another oceanic language. It appears in the Trobriand archipelago, but is more associated with the island of Santa Isabella, part of an island environment just to the south and slightly to the east of where the central portion of the Bismarck archipelago is situated. So as you're listening to the language and you're looking at some of the carvings, some of the expressive culture, some of the language associated with specific religious and magical traditions, and also the important role that color plays in much of this tradition. Uh, Bobwa, Pabwakao, Bayani, these important colors of, in this case, black versus white, and then the incorporation of red, sometimes all three incorporated into a particular kind of object or some sort of magical rite or incantation. Also look at who is involved in producing objects and then blessing those objects. These are all important characteristics as they relate to the traditional culture, and then how those characteristics and traditions carry across with the language into this more syncretized process, and a process that also includes cultural uh, invention. This will be important for how you look at the interaction and the interlinking that occurs between these two cultural traditions. So a little bit about Bugatu, which you will be looking at as an applied example in your own studies, comparing it to Kilavila or Kirivina, um, and some of the traditions to the north and slightly to the west. Um, Bugatu, like Kilavila, is one of several outside languages that are now commonly spoken in the Trobriand Islands. This is an area that saw a considerable amount of human migration since early prehistory, but then all the way through the historic and modern age. And now, of course, in the postmodern age, we're seeing that same kind of process occurring as well. Um, Both of these language traditions, though, we will consider to be, in a sense, focused on this island environment. Bugatu's core expressions, as I said before, are slightly to the south and to the east. Now, Bugatu is a little bit different in the sense that it is a more recent outsider to the region, traveling to the Trobriand Islands and then extending to the south and east through the lens of, or through the connection with, the British colonial system. So, as the British colonial rule was extended to this part of the South Pacific, and we will even see it in Fiji and other important locations, people and traditions and languages were, in a sense, imported into the region, and they took hold, very similar to what we have seen or what we know archaeologically of how this region was peopled thousands of years before British colonial rule. It was, in a sense, a movement of people out and across the Pacific for a variety of reasons. In the British colonial tradition, it was part of their global expansion. But needless to say, people moved through these regions, and then communities and traditions began to grow organically through the island nations or within the island nations. So the film, in a sense, will give you at least one example of this process of interaction and then either syncretism, which we'll see in the film, or the idea of almost a seeding of culture in this case, other examples prior to the British colonial period, but this would be more of a syncretism in terms of what we're looking at with regard to Trobriand cricket. So in the film, the Trobriand expression Keesa is used to describe competition in the post-colonial global world in Bugatu. There is a related expression, a little bit smaller, Oka, which is often applied or commonly applied to this process of interaction with outsiders. So keep a close eye on the interactions that are occurring and how they are, in a sense, dramatized in the sport, and how indigenous peoples are interpreting the traditions of, in this case, the people of Great Britain. All of this then can be also understood in relation to the processes within global social change and within this much larger kind of parent process of globalization, of in this case, decolonization and resistance. Sometimes the words and practices that you choose to adopt or to retain, these are expressions of how you are dealing with the vacuumous state of a post-colonial age, or how you are dealing with resistance, or how you are expressing your resistance to change. We'll see this in the film as well, and some of the ethnographic interviews that are being conducted will express this as they relate to, in this case, missionary schools and the ideologies and the practices of missionaries who have traditionally and historically worked in these regions. Decolonization, just to look at this a little bit more closely and then relate it to another couple of colonial examples. It is something that is not solely economic, just like globalization is not solely economic. It represents that kind of vacuous state that follows the end of colonial rule, when people are, to some degree, given their autonomy back, given, in a sense, their own self rule back as a colonial power then leaves an environment. But as we know, and the process of globalization definitely helps us to better understand that, the interdependencies that are forged through the early stages of global social contact, such as colonization, these things will persist even when that colonial rule is lifted. The term or expression popular sovereignty is something that we can connect to this idea of now indigenous autonomy, or that decolonial space where indigenous peoples or the one-time colonized groups are now allowed to assert their own sovereignty over their own land, their language, their traditions, their natural resources, so on and so forth. The Harvard-trained political economist Rupert Emerson wrote extensively on the decolonialization, or the process of decolonizing that occurred after the Second World War. And this part of the world, Oceania, provides a really good example of how this played out. He writes, "It was the turning of the weapons, the ideas, the instruments, the institutions of the West against itself, which swung the balance of power against imperialism." He gives some examples: the Indian National Congress, the Convention People's Party of the Gold Coast, and similar nationalist movements of a modern type as being an example of this rise of popular sovereignty that occurred after and near the end of the Second World War. He wrote this in the 1960s. That's what we're looking at here, but on a much smaller scale. In a sense, we are looking at a political response to the incompatibility that exists between empire and nation, between the imperial system, a system represented by a process like colonialism, and what comes after, ultimately, also what comes before that colonial period. So we're seeing the response that people have in their local communities after that colonial age ends. How much of it is a natural process of a dismantling of that colonial structure, and then how much of that is a form of individual and group level resistance. So ultimately, to understand what comes after colonialism or a colonial age, or a national ethnic response to imperialism, we have to know something about what colonialism is and ultimately what imperialism is. When we think about colonialization or colonialism, we recognize this to be, in a sense, a relationship between the colonized and those colonizing. It's very much of a power relationship that permeates more than just economic life. It is a relationship between those that have power and those that do not or who do not. This is something that we can understand not only in terms of its historical expression, but the independent movements that come during and after the colonial power leaves a region. Let's take a look at two examples as we kind of round out this lecture and have you then look at that film example. We'll start with Spanish colonial rule. We know that Spanish colonial rule was intense. It had a strong impact on individual cultures. In a sense, it reached so deeply into a culture that it transformed even the language, right? The term Hispanic really is born of these interactions during the Spanish colonial age and under the process of colonialism as it is expressed through Spanish culture. Spain made its American colonies, in a sense, miniaturized empires or expressions of the larger Spanish Empire. Reinos, or these vice royalties of Spanish America, are very good examples of how Spanish colonialism worked. You had places like New Spain, you had Peru, you had New Granada, you had Buenos Aires, all of these different small empires that they created, these viceroyalties that were interlinked and connected back to the Spanish crown through things like marriage alliances. So, Castilians, if you're familiar with this part of Spanish history, Castilians were administrative leaders within the European Spanish system of colonialism. They would meet in Madrid, and in a sense, they controlled the activities of all of the colonies throughout the Americas. Now, Spain did this not just in North and South America, they did this across the globe, but it was their system that they used to, in a sense, impose power and to impose their own cultural traditions on regions that they oversaw. Realize this, though, that Spain, it was a two-way street. Spain very much experienced a kind of cultural contact from their colonies and vice versa. Nationalism and citizenship were used to, in a sense, assert Spanish colonial administrative authority. In a sense, as you were made a citizen of Spain through this remote process, you were allied to Spain, and the community that you were a part of was allied to the Spanish crown. You then became part of Spain through economic obligation, and in a sense, you became subservient to that kind of core metropolis that we recognize to be European Spain. Now, in terms of how indigenous populations in places like North America, South America, the Philippines, and other locations, um, even in Southeast Asia, how they experienced the Spanish colonial age, generally the greatest impact was economic. The idea of paying tribute to the crown was something that was very, very common. And how Spain moved out into these indigenous areas and the kinds of administrative structures that they developed and then connected back to that kind of source metropolis area, these very much were lines or avenues for tribute or tax to flow across. Um, as that was established, and as we have these almost tiny little Spains developing across the globe, we also see another kind of process at work, and one that you're very familiar with regard to language, and we see it with the development of the Hispanic tradition, in this case, creolization. So the creolization of culture and language was something that we very much want to associate with how the Spanish ruled their colonies. And it very much expressed itself not only in the colonial age, but then how these regions experienced, in varying ways, independence following the colonial age and how they experience the world today. It still has very much of that strong Spanish fingerprint still upon it. Portugal is another example. The Portuguese are considered to be kind of a federal monarchical colonial system. There were no separate but equal kingdoms in their colonial holdings. Rather, they had a complete colonial society that they developed. So instead of having all of these small little empires or kingships that were developing, or kingdoms that were developing, in terms of Portugal and their colonial practices, we saw the spread of a complete colonial society that no matter where you were in that society, you were still part of it. What made the Portuguese tradition different from what we saw in Spain, and to some degree different from what we see with British colonial rule, is that it was much more violent. They created, in a sense, these pseudo military governorships that were administrative powers throughout that single colonial society. And they led that single colonial society, or that portion that they were affiliated with, through extreme force. So if you think about the history of Brazil, for example, and their experience with the Portuguese, it was, especially indigenous populations, it was very much at the tip of a rifle that they experienced change. How they then experienced independence and resistance is very much a part of that story, that colonial story. Brazil, for example, really broke free and sought its own popular sovereignty, even though the language that is common to Brazil is Portuguese. But the idea of Portugal and rule is very much divorced in the Brazilian expression. It is Brazilian and not necessarily Portuguese. So the, the experience of those colonized communities under Portugal rule, or rule from Portugal, were in a sense very different from what we saw with Spain, and as I said, to a lesser extent, what we saw with Great Britain, and what you'll be seeing in the film presentation and some of the associated history. But the idea here is that it was very much of a military rule. It created a single colonial society, and then that all was connected to the monarchical rule that we see in Portugal up until the 1930s when places like Brazil fight for their independence. And that's usually what we see with colonies associated with Portuguese rule, that they fought for their independence and they won their independence. And once they win their independence, they allow their traditions to rise to the surface. The odd piece here is the language. Portuguese is retained, and something that is retained in a pretty traditional sense in terms of the spoken language. And so that is something that anthropologists and social historians continue to look at more closely to understand why and how the language tradition was retained completely while there was this push for independence in that post-colonial vacuum, and all, of course, tied to this notion of resistance as we approach the 20th century. As I said, places like Brazil win their independence in the 1930s. They become their own sovereign nations as part of that push for independence. So when you take a look at the Trobriand example, think about a variety of themes here. Think about the idea of syncretism and cultural invention. Think about globalization and how it brings communities together. It interlinks them and creates mutual dependency in varying degrees. Always keep in mind that colonialism, as it is experienced, is something that is not experienced the same way, but is very much of a product of its unique history and of the communities that are interacting with one another. Finally, as you're looking at the film and framing it into this kind of larger concept, look at how the interaction occurs. It is not solely economic, it is not solely political, it is not solely social, but it is a blending of all of those different qualities of life. And the language is found in all of those particular spheres that are interacting with one another. What is the role of the language in maintaining sovereignty? What is the role of the language in supporting or allowing syncretism or blending to occur as well? Finally, as you think about the Trobriand island, frame it in terms of the subjects that you're reading about this week, which are things relating to race and ethnicity. Remember that the term nation is really an ethnic term. Your ethnicity is nearly inseparable from your nationality. In fact, some individuals, or the majority of individuals, you could say, define their ethnicity through the lens of nationality. So when a person says that they are Irish American, that is an ethnic and nationalistic label that they assign to themselves, to their community, and to their traditions. We will see that expressed in this film. We will see it expressed in the history of this part of the Pacific. How does the language usage, language replacement, and creolization allow for independent expressions of ethnicity and nationality, and to an extent race? How do how does the language, in a sense, allow those independent phenomena to coexist with one another? And then where and at what point do we see the language being blended or creolized, and why? The last thing I'll leave you with is the divide between ethnicity and race. Realize that when a sociologist or an anthropologist are talking about race, they acknowledge the biological qualities of race, but they're also acknowledging, in this case, the social and behavioral qualities of race as well, as a social unit. Race, like ethnicity, allows us to define and identify social groups and create boundaries around those social groups to be able to better understand them. In fact, sometimes we create boundaries around the social groups that we are a part of to better understand who we are and our identity. Frame all of that as you're looking at Trobriand cricket and the experiences of people living throughout the Bismarck Archipelago.